The morning Delia Marsh packed the last of their belongings into 2 garbage bags and 3 cardboard boxes held together with packing tape. Her daughter didn't cry. Camille was 7 years old and had already learned, in the way that children of desperate circumstances learn, that crying was a luxury they couldn't afford. She sat on the edge of the bare mattress they were leaving behind, her small hands folded in her lap, watching her mother move through the empty apartment with the focused efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment too many times. The landlord had given them until 8 in the morning. It was 7:42. The apartment on Ridley Street had never been much, 2 rooms above a laundromat in the part of Briar Falls, Ohio, that the city's brochures never photographed. The walls were the color of old teeth. The radiator knocked through every winter night like something desperate trying to get out. The kitchen window faced a brick wall, but it had been theirs, or as close to theirs as a month-to-month lease could be, and now it wasn't even that. Delia had lost her job at the packaging plant in February, 3 days after Valentine's Day, on a Tuesday so gray it seemed the sky itself had given up. 14 years she had stood on that floor, sorting and stacking and sealing, her hands moving so fast they'd stopped feeling like her own. 14 years, and they gave her a manila envelope with 2 weeks of severance and a handshake from a supervisor who couldn't meet her eyes. She'd filed for unemployment. She'd taken on cleaning work wherever she could find it. She'd stretched every dollar until it was transparent as cellophane. But February became March, became April, and the math never changed. The numbers always came out the same way, and the number was wrong. She zipped up the second garbage bag and looked around the apartment one last time. She had grown up being told that poor people didn't have the right to feel loss over spaces, that only people with real homes got to grieve them. She'd believed that for a long time. Standing in that empty room, she decided she didn't believe it anymore. "Mama," Camille said from the mattress, "why does the floor echo now?" Delia looked at her daughter. 7 years old, brown eyes wide and unafraid, asking the kind of question that could break a person open if they let it. "Because the room is empty, baby," Delia said. 2 empty rooms echo." Camille considered this with the gravity of a child processing something larger than the words. "Are we going to be empty too?" Delia crossed the room and gathered her daughter against her chest. She held her there, breathing her in, feeling the small weight of her, the realness of her. "No," she said quietly. "We are never going to be empty. You understand me? Never." They carried their bags down the narrow staircase and out into the cool April morning. The street was already alive with the ordinary sounds of people going places, buses hissing at stops, a dog barking 2 blocks over, a radio playing from an open window above the corner store. Nobody looked at them. Nobody noticed the 2 garbage bags and the taped boxes being loaded into the back of a 12-year-old Nissan with a cracked left taillight. This was Briar Falls. People packed up and left all the time. Delia had exactly $411 in her checking account and $63 in cash. She had a sister in Columbus who had a couch but not enough room, and a mother in Dayton who had room but not enough grace. She had applied to every shelter within 40 miles and been placed on waiting lists that moved like glaciers. She had a daughter who was in 2nd grade and needed to stay in the same school district if there was going to be any continuity, any anchor in the unmoored water of their lives. She drove. She didn't know yet where she was driving to. She just drove. It was at the gas station on Route 9 while she was putting $13 of regular into the tank and trying to calculate whether she could afford both gas and dinner, and that she saw the notice tacked to the community board beside the door. The board was the usual chaos of flyers, colored paper layered over colored paper, lost cats and guitar lessons, and rooms for rent and handymen available weekends. She almost didn't look. She had stopped looking at community boards months ago because, looking at things, she couldn't have felt like pressing a bruise. But something made her glance. Maybe it was the word chapel. Maybe it was the fact that the notice was printed in plain black ink on white paper. No border, no decoration, just words. Blunt and direct as a fact. Property transfer notice. St. Agatha's Chapel, 14 Hollow Creek Road, Briar Falls Township. Unclaimed estate property. One-time acquisition, as is condition. All structural defects disclosed. Minimum administrative transfer fee, $1. So interested parties must present in person to the Briar Falls Township office by April 30th. Property will revert to county demolition order if unclaimed. Delia read it twice, then a third time. $1. $1 for a chapel. She knew enough about the world to know there was a catch. There was always a catch. A property being given away for $1 meant it was either worthless, dangerous, legally complicated, or all three. She'd heard of these transfers before. Abandoned buildings handed off just to get them off the county's liability rolls. Nothing more than a headache wrapped in a deed. But Camille was asleep in the back seat, her head tipped against the window, her breath fogging the glass in small clouds, and they had nowhere to sleep tonight. Delia took the notice off the board, folded it, and put it in her pocket. The Briar Falls Township office was a squat tan building on Mercer Street that smelled of old carpet and municipal resignation. The woman at the front desk, a heavy-set woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an expression of practiced neutrality, looked up when Delia came in with Camille trailing behind her, still half asleep and clutching a stuffed rabbit named Gerald. "I'm here about the chapel," Delia said. "St. Agatha's, the property transfer." The woman's expression shifted slightly, something between surprise and something else Delia couldn't quite name. "You want to claim it?" "I want to know what's wrong with it first." The woman almost smiled. "Honey, what isn't wrong with it?" She pulled a thick folder from a filing cabinet behind her desk. Built in 1887. Last active congregation dissolved 1962. Passed through 4 different private owners, all of whom abandoned it within a few years. The last owner died intestate in 2019. No heirs, no will. It's been sitting in township limbo ever since. She spread several documents on the counter. Foundation has significant settling on the east side. The roof has multiple failure points. No utilities connected. Potential asbestos in the original plaster. Not confirmed, but flagged. The grounds haven't been maintained in about a decade. There was a partial collapse of the rear vestibule in 2021. Delia looked at the documents. Maps, assessment sheets, photographs. In the photographs, the chapel was a gray stone building at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by overgrown oak trees that had grown so tall they'd begun to swallow the structure. The stained glass windows, well, at least the ones that remained, were boarded from the outside with plywood darkened by weather. The front door was chained shut. The small bell tower leaned very slightly to one side, like a man who'd had too much to drink, but was determined not to fall. "Has anyone else looked at it?" Delia asked. "In 5 years. You're the first person who's walked through that door asking about it." The woman paused, "Which tells you something." "It tells me it's available," Delia said. The woman looked at her for a long moment, then looked at Camille, who was examining the stapler on the edge of the counter with scientific interest. Something in the woman's face softened almost imperceptibly. "Administrative transfer fee is $1, she said. "You'll also be assuming all tax liability going forward. Not current outstanding taxes are $740, waived under the estate dissolution clause for first-time community transfer claimants. You'd owe nothing on back taxes." She paused again. "Structurally, you can't live in it legally without a certificate of occupancy, which you'd need to get through the building department. But the land is yours the moment you sign." Delia thought about the $411 in her account, the $63 in cash, and the 2 garbage bags in the back of the Nissan. "I'll take it," she said. The woman pulled out the transfer paperwork. Camille looked up from the stapler. "Mama, are we buying something?" "We're buying a chapel, baby." Camille thought about this. "Does it have a floor?" "Yes." "Then it's better than the car," Camille said, and went back to examining the stapler. The drive to Hollow Creek Road took 20 minutes. The road itself was barely a road, a 2-track lane of cracked asphalt that had been reclaimed in places by grass growing up through the fractures, lined on both sides by old oaks, whose roots had buckled the surface into something closer to a geological feature than a road. Delia drove slowly, the Nissan suspension complaining at every dip and heave. When the chapel appeared through the trees, she stopped the car. She had looked at the photographs in the township office. She thought she knew what to expect. She was wrong. The photographs hadn't captured the scale of it, or the strange dignity of it. St. Agatha's was not large, maybe 40 feet long and 20 wide, with a small bell tower at the front that rose perhaps 30 feet above the roofline. But the stone it was built from was limestone, old limestone quarried from somewhere in this same Ohio earth, and that stone had weathered 138 years without yielding its fundamental integrity. The walls stood. Whatever else had failed, the walls stood. The oaks around it had grown into enormous cathedral-like forms themselves, their canopies interlocking overhead so that the chapel sat in a kind of natural nave, green-filtered light falling across the gray stone in patterns that shifted with the wind. The grounds were wild, chest-high weeds, and volunteer saplings reclaiming the paths, vines climbing the east wall all the way to the sill of a boarded window. But beneath the wildness, Delia could see the bones of what had been, a small garden wall of stacked stone, the curve of a path still faintly visible in the earth, the remains of an iron fence with an arched gate that still stood straight. She got out of the car. The air smelled of green things and old stone, and something she couldn't name, a mineral smell, cool and faintly sweet, like water running over rock underground. Camille climbed out behind her and stood looking at the chapel with her head tilted and her stuffed rabbit hanging from one hand. "It's big," Camille said. "It is. It looks sad." Delia looked at her daughter. "Things that have been forgotten look sad. That doesn't mean they are." Camille considered the chapel for another moment. "Can we go in?" The chain on the front door was secured with a padlock that had been there long enough to rust itself partially open. The shackle corroded in a way that allowed it to be jiggled free with patience. Delia worked at it for several minutes, while Camille inspected a large stone near the door that had a depression in its surface filled with rainwater. "It's a bird bath," Camille announced with authority. The door was solid oak, swollen in its frame from decades of moisture cycles, and it took both of them pushing to convince it to open. It moved with a groan so deep it seemed to come from the building's foundations. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of stone and old wood and the faint ghost of something like candle smoke, though no candles had burned here in decades. The interior was a single room, the nave, with wooden pews still in place, most still structurally sound, though covered in a thick layer of dust and bird droppings. The floor was wide plank oak, the planks darkened and gapped with age. At the far end, a simple wooden altar table stood below the window, which had retained its stained glass, a rendering of a woman in blue, cracked in 2 places and repaired at some point, with what appeared to be clear tape that had long since yellowed and peeled. Light came through the gaps in the boarded windows in thin gold bars, striping the dusty floor. Camille walked slowly down the center aisle between the pews, her footsteps sounding in the silence, each one followed by a faint resonance, the floor carrying and amplifying each impact just slightly. She stopped, took a step, listened. "Mama," she said. "I hear it, baby." Why does the floor echo? Delia stood at the back of the nave, listening. Camille was right. Each footstep had a quality that went beyond the ordinary resonance of hardwood. There was something beneath it, a depth to the sound, as if each step were traveling farther than it should, as if below the oak planks the sound had somewhere to go. I don't know, Delia said. Old floors sometimes do that. But she was watching the floor as she said it. The planks were wide, old-growth oak, and they ran straight and true along the length of the nave. At the far end, near the altar, there was a section where the planks seemed darker, not just dirtier, but a different shade, as if they had been replaced at some point with wood from a different source, or as if something beneath that section kept the wood differently conditioned. She walked forward slowly, watching the floor, feeling each step. Near the altar, she stopped and pressed her foot down deliberately. The echo came back differently here, deeper, broader, as if the space below this section of floor was larger. She looked at the altar table. It had been moved at some point. She could see the marks in the dust where its feet had originally stood, several inches to the left of where it stood now. Someone had moved it and never moved it back. She crouched and examined the floor beneath where the altar had originally stood. In the dust, barely visible, was a seam, a line too straight and too deliberate to be a natural gap between planks. Her heart moved in her chest in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement exactly. Something older than excitement. Something closer to recognition. She pressed her palm flat against the floor and felt the cold of the stone below radiating up through the wood. "Mama," Camille said from beside the altar. She had found something. She was pointing at the stone base of the altar, where the wood met the floor. In the corner of the stone base, barely visible beneath decades of grime, was an iron ring, flat against the stone, the kind of ring that folded flush when not in use. A handle. Delia stared at it for a long moment. Then she stood up, went back to the door, and looked out at the car in the overgrown drive, the 2 garbage bags in the back, the taped boxes, the 12-year-old Nissan with the cracked taillight. She came back inside. "We're going to need some tools," she said. That first night they slept in the car, parked in the shade of the oaks. Delia had a sleeping bag in the trunk, and Camille had the rear seat and a blanket, and Gerald the rabbit. Delia sat in the driver's seat with the door cracked and listened to the dark around the chapel, the sounds of the woods, the rustle of something small in the weeds, the far-off calling of an owl. She thought about the iron ring. She thought about the way the floor echoed. She thought about the woman at the township office saying, "You're the first person who's walked through that door asking about it," and the look on her face when she said it. She thought about all the people who had owned this property before her, 4 of them, all of whom had let it go. Why had they let it go? She told herself there were 100 reasonable explanations. The cost of restoration, the remoteness of the location, the structural problems, the absence of utilities. People took on projects they couldn't finish all the time. It wasn't sinister. It was ordinary human limitation. But the iron ring didn't feel ordinary. The moved altar didn't feel ordinary. The depth in that echo didn't feel ordinary. She sat in the dark for a long time, and then she made a decision. In the morning, she drove to the hardware store on Main Street with 40 of her $63 and bought a pry bar, a heavy flashlight, a box of contractor bags, a pair of work gloves, and a padlock for the front door. The cashier, a teenager with elaborate sneakers, rang up her items without looking at her. On the way back, she stopped at the dollar store and bought 2 bottles of water, a package of crackers, and a small jar of peanut butter. Breakfast and lunch for both of them, probably dinner too. She drove back to Hollow Creek Road. The chapel looked the same in the morning light, gray and still and patient, the oaks moving overhead. But it looked less abandoned than it had the day before. Or maybe she was just seeing it differently now that it belonged to her. $1. She had paid $1 for those stone walls and that oak floor and whatever lay beneath it. She unlocked the front door with her new padlock key, which felt like an act of such strangeness she almost laughed. Camille carried the flashlight and the crackers. "Are we going to live here?" Camille asked. "We're going to see about that." "I think we should," Camille said. "It smells like old books. I like old books." "It smells like mold and bird droppings, baby." "And old books," Camille said firmly. They set up in the front pews, me spreading their crackers and peanut butter out on a board, laid across 2 pew backs, like a rough table. Camille ate methodically and looked around at the chapel interior with the assessing eye of a 7-year-old who has decided to take something seriously. "The windows are pretty," she said, "even the cracked one." Delia looked at the stained glass at the front, the woman in blue. In the morning light coming through the unboarded east windows, the glass caught the light and threw colors across the dusty floor, blue and amber, and a deep red that pooled near the altar like something spilled. "Yes," Delia said. "They are." After breakfast, she set Camille to a project of sweeping the front half of the nave with a wide-headed broom she'd found in the closet near the door, which also contained a rusted handsaw, 3 empty paint cans, and what appeared to be an old hymn book with its cover gone. Delia herself went to the altar end. She moved the altar table, which was heavier than it looked, built from solid oak and pegged together in the manner of old furniture, made to last forever. When she moved it fully aside, the section of floor she had noticed the day before was fully revealed. It was perhaps 4 feet by 3 feet, the planks running the same direction as the rest of the floor, but subtly different in color, the seams between them slightly wider, and in each of the 4 corners of the section, almost invisible under the grime, was a small iron pin set flush with the wood. Not nails. Pins. The kind that could be removed. She put on her work gloves and took the pry bar. From the front of the nave, Camille's small voice called out, "Mama, I found a dead pigeon." "Leave it alone, baby." "I already poked it." "With what?" "The broom." "That's fine. Keep sweeping." Delia crouched beside the 4-foot section of floor and worked the tip of the pry bar into the seam at the near edge. The wood was tight, swollen with age, and for a moment nothing moved. She pressed harder, adjusting the angle, working her weight onto the bar. The creak that followed was enormous in the silence of the chapel, a deep, tearing groan that bounced off the stone walls and made Camille call out from the front, "Mama, I'm okay. Keep sweeping." The section of floor lifted. Not smoothly, not easily, but it lifted, the 4 iron pins disengaging from their housings with a sound like muffled shots, one after another, and then the whole piece came free, and she set it to the side. Below was stone. Not the earth, not a dirt cellar. Stone, cut and laid with precision, the same limestone as the chapel walls. Steps, 7 of them, descending into darkness, the edges worn smooth with use, the kind of smooth that comes from many feet over many years. And from below, a smell. Not the smell of rot, not the smell of a forgotten space, a mineral smell, cool and dry, with something underneath it she couldn't identify, something almost metallic, like the air before a lightning storm but stilled and ancient. She turned on the flashlight and pointed it down. The beam caught the steps, the walls of cut stone, and at the bottom, the beginning of a floor. And on that floor, barely visible at the edge of the flashlight's range, shapes. Not natural shapes, not the shapes of settling stone or accumulated debris. Rectangular shapes. Organized. arranged. Her breath stopped. She stood at the top of those steps for a long moment that seemed to contain an entire history. The 2 garbage bags in the Nissan, the empty apartment on Ridley Street, the manila envelope with the 2 weeks of severance, Camille's voice asking, "Why does the floor echo?" The echo itself, the iron ring, the moved altar, the $1, the 4 owners who had let it go. She put her foot on the first step. The stone was cold through her shoe. The flashlight beam preceded her as she descended, illuminating the walls, which were cut smooth and covered in a thin layer of mineral deposit, the kind that builds over centuries when water moves slowly through limestone. The steps were dry. The air was cool, not damp, sealed and preserved. As she reached the bottom step, the full space revealed itself, and she stood there in the beam of her flashlight, with her hand pressed against the stone wall, and simply looked. The crypt was perhaps 25 feet long and 15 feet wide, the ceiling arched, the same limestone vault construction as the chapel above, built to carry weight and time. Along both walls, stone shelves had been built into the rock, deep shelves, 3 tiers high, running the length of the room. And on those shelves, laid in rows with the deliberateness of something intentionally stored rather than discarded, were objects wrapped in heavy cloth, the cloth dark with age, tied with what had once been twine, but had become something more like fiber. The rectangular shapes she had seen from the top of the stairs. She counted them in the beam of her flashlight. 12 on the left wall, 12 on the right. And at the far end, mine centered on the back wall, a stone table, like a second altar, and on it, something else entirely. A wooden box, small, perhaps 18 inches long, secured with a brass mechanism that had aged to the color of a winter sky. Delia walked slowly to the nearest shelf. She picked up the cloth-wrapped package closest to her, surprised by its weight, expecting lightness, getting the opposite. It was dense, heavy as a brick. She set it on the stone floor and unwrapped the cloth with hands that she ordered to be steady, that trembled anyway. The cloth fell away. What it revealed was a bar, approximately 10 inches long, 3 inches wide, 2 inches deep, the surface slightly rough, not polished, never polished, with a matte finish the color of something deep in the earth before the earth gives it up. Gold. Not jewelry gold, not decorative gold. Raw gold. A cast bar of raw gold with markings pressed into one face, characters she didn't recognize at first glance, a cross, a date in Roman numerals, and a series of numbers that meant nothing to her, but were clearly systematic, clearly a record. She set it down, sat back on her heels, looked at the shelves around her. 24 wrapped packages on the shelves, each the same approximate size and weight as the one she held. She stood and walked to the back wall, to the stone table, to the wooden box. The brass mechanism was a clasp, not a lock, and it opened with pressure, the lid rising on dry hinges that made no sound at all. Inside the box, on a bed of dark cloth that had once perhaps been red, were documents. Papers, thick with age, folded and wrapped in a material she couldn't identify, something like waxed linen, or that had kept them almost perfectly preserved. She lifted the top one with careful fingers and unfolded it. The handwriting was in English, copperplate, formal, the ink brown with age, but fully legible. At the top, in larger letters, property of the Order of St. Agatha, held in trust, deposited this 14th day of March, 1889. Beneath it, a list, a careful, systematic, numbered list. Item 1 through item 24, each described in brief Latin followed by an English annotation, each annotated with a weight in troy ounces. She didn't know the price of gold. She didn't know what any of this meant in the language of money. She was a woman who had packed 2 garbage bags that morning and driven away from a life with $63 in cash and no plan beyond the next hour. But she had been counting since she was a child, the way poor people count, automatically, precisely, without hope, but without stopping. 24 bars. She looked at the first one again, its size, its weight in her hands. She sat down on the stone floor of the crypt of St. Agatha's Chapel, 14 Hollow Creek Road, Briar Falls, Ohio, with the document in her lap and the flashlight balanced against the wall and the bar of gold beside her. From above, through the thickness of stone and old wood, she heard Camille's voice, faint and bright. "Mama, I finished sweeping. Can we eat more crackers?" Delia sat very still for a moment. Then she called back, her voice coming out steadier than she'd expected. "Yes, baby. I'll be right up." She rewrapped the bar carefully in its cloth. She folded the document and returned it to the wooden box. She closed the clasp. She stood up, picked up the flashlight, and looked around the crypt one last time. The stone shelves, the wrapped bars, the arched ceiling, the cool, dry air that had held its secret for more than 100 years. Then she walked back to the stairs, put her foot on the first step, and climbed toward the light. When she emerged into the nave and slid the floor section back into place and set the altar table back over it, her hands had stopped trembling. Camille was sitting in the front pew with Gerald and the crackers, her feet swinging, watching her mother with the patient attention of a child who has learned that adults sometimes disappear into tasks and reappear changed. "What were you doing?" Camille asked. Delia sat down beside her daughter, took a cracker, spread it with peanut butter, and looked at the woman in the blue-stained glass. "I was looking at the floor," she said. "Does it still echo?" "Yes," Delia said. "It does." Camille leaned against her mother's arm. "I like it when things echo," she said. "It means something's listening." Delia put her arm around her daughter and held her close, looking at the gold light falling through the cracked glass, the colors pooling on the floor above where 24 bars of gold lay wrapped in century-old cloth on stone shelves in the dark below. "Something is definitely listening," she said quietly. That afternoon, Delia drove to the public library on Center Street and used the free internet terminal for 45 minutes. She didn't know where to begin, so she began where anyone begins when they are trying to understand something completely outside their experience. She began with questions. She searched for the price of gold. She found it immediately, the spot price, updated by the minute on financial websites, the number expressed per troy ounce, the standard measurement for precious metals. She sat with the number for a moment. Then she searched for the weight of a standard gold bar, because she didn't know the exact weight of what she'd held in the crypt, only its size and density. The standard gold bar used in institutional storage, the kind held by central banks and national treasuries, weighed approximately 400 troy ounces. What she had held had been smaller than that, not a standard modern bar, but something older, cast to a different specification. She thought about the weight in her hands and searched for historical gold bar weights, the kind used in the late 19th century, and the kind that matched the date on the document. She found a reference to ecclesiastical gold storage in European church archives, bars cast in the tradition of monastic treasuries, typically between 200 and 250 troy ounces. She sat very still at the library terminal. She did the arithmetic 3 times to make sure she was doing it right. At 200 troy ounces per bar, 24 bars. At the current spot price per troy ounce. The number that came out was not a number she had ever associated with herself or her life or any version of reality she had inhabited. She closed the browser, deleted the history as the library's instructions asked her to, and sat for a moment looking at the blank screen. Then she opened the browser again and searched for something different. St. Agatha's Chapel, Briar Falls, Ohio. History. There wasn't much. A line in a county historical society listing, a mention in a 1924 local newspaper archive she could only partially access, a photograph, undated, in a digitized collection from the Ohio Historical Society, showing the chapel as it had been, the grounds maintained, a small group of figures standing in front of the door, their faces too small to read. But in the caption beneath the photograph, a sentence. St. Agatha's Chapel, established 1887 by the Society of the Sisters of St. Agatha, a contemplative order originating in Belgium, dissolved 1962. Belgium. She thought about the document in the wooden box. The date, March 1889, 2 years after the chapel's establishment. The cross-shaped mark on the bars, the Latin annotations on the list. She searched. Sisters of St. Agatha, Belgium Contemplative Order. She found very little. A brief mention in a Catholic encyclopedia describing a small Belgian order founded in 1861 that had maintained houses in several countries before dissolving in the mid-20th century. Their charism had been contemplative prayer and the preservation of sacred objects, a phrase that caught her eye and held it. The preservation of sacred objects. She closed the browser again. She sat in the library among the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon. A child asking a librarian for help. The hum of the HVAC system. The distant sound of traffic on Center Street. And she thought about a group of Belgian nuns arriving in Briar Falls, Ohio in 1887, building a chapel of good limestone, and in 1889, 2 years after their arrival, descending into a crypt beneath their altar and laying down 24 wrapped bars of gold on stone shelves built for exactly that purpose. And then, time. Years and decades of time. The congregation dissolving in 1962. The property passing to private hands. Those hands letting it go, 4 sets of them, each one arriving and departing. None of them, apparently, finding the floor that echoed. Or had they found it? She thought about the iron ring. It hadn't been hidden. It had been there, in the stone base of the altar, in plain sight if you knew to look. But you had to move the altar to see it clearly, and you had to be the kind of person who noticed that a floor echoed wrong, who listened to a 7-year-old daughter saying, "Why does the floor echo?" and heard something in it. She drove back to Hollow Creek Road. In the early evening light, the chapel was something else entirely. The oaks threw long shadows across the limestone, and the light came through the trees at an angle that turned everything amber and specific, the way light gets in the last hour before it disappears. She sat in the car for a while looking at it. $1, she thought. I paid $1 for this. She thought about the people who had laughed at her, which was a longer list than she ever let herself dwell on. The supervisor who had handed her the manila envelope without looking her in the eyes. The landlord who had called twice in the last week to ask when she was getting out. Her sister in Columbus who'd said, with the careful gentleness of someone delivering bad news, that she just didn't have the room. You know how it is. Not the man at the unemployment office who'd looked at her file and said the processing time was 8 to 12 weeks, in a tone that communicated clearly that he did not expect this to be a problem for a woman like her. She thought about all of them. Then she thought about Camille, who was asleep in the back seat again, who had swept the entire front half of the nave of a 138-year-old chapel with a rusted broom because her mother had asked her to, who had declared that it smelled like old books, and old books were good, who had heard the echo and asked about it with the seriousness of someone who understood that echoes meant something. Delia got out of the car and went into the chapel. She sat in the front pew in the blue-amber light from the stained glass and looked at the altar. She needed to think carefully. She needed to think about what she knew and what she didn't know and what to do next. Because she had been poor long enough to understand one thing with absolute clarity. Finding something and keeping it were two entirely different problems, and the second one was almost always harder than the first. The gold in the crypt was old. Over a century old. That meant it had a legal history she knew nothing about. That meant questions of ownership, of provenance, of what the law said about found property, especially property found in a religious structure, especially property with documented records attached to it, especially property that had been deposited by an order that no longer existed. She didn't know any of those answers, but she knew something else. She knew that the moment she told someone, the moment she walked into any official office or made any phone call that could be traced, the thing she had found would become the thing other people were deciding about. And she had spent her entire life in spaces where other people decided things, and the decisions were never in her favor. So she needed to be careful. She needed to be smart. She needed to know what she had before she said a word to anyone. She sat in the front pew until the light through the stained glass faded and the chapel went dark and cool around her. Then she went back to the car, checked on Camille, still sleeping, still holding Gerald, and sat in the driver's seat with the windows cracked and the darkness of Hollow Creek Road around her. In the morning, she decided, she would go back down into the crypt. She would document everything. She would be systematic and careful, and she would do it alone, just her and the flashlight and the stone shelves and the wrapped bars and the wooden box. And then she would figure out what came next. The owl called again from somewhere in the oaks, the same one as last night, or a different one. It was impossible to tell. The sound moved through the dark and was gone. Delia sat very still in the driver's seat of her 12-year-old car in the driveway of her $1 chapel and breathed the night air, which smelled of green things and old stone and something mineral and cool and deep. The same smell she had noticed when she first stood at the threshold of the crypt, the smell of something that had been waiting. The next morning came gray and soft, clouds moving low over the oaks, the air cool with the threat of rain. Camille woke before Delia and sat up in the back seat with her rabbit and her hair going in every direction, and announced that she was hungry and that the birds were very loud this morning, and she wanted to know if the chapel had a bathroom. Not yet, Delia said. When? Soon, Delia said, which was not a lie but was not a promise either, and Camille seemed to understand the difference because she said okay and began looking for crackers. They ate breakfast in the front pew again, peanut butter and crackers and the last of the water from yesterday, and Delia gave Camille a task to carefully remove the remaining boards from the east-facing windows so that more light could come in. The boards were nailed from outside, which meant Camille would need to work from outside with the pry bar under close supervision. This would take a long time and require great concentration and keep a 7-year-old thoroughly occupied while her mother descended into a crypt. It worked. Delia went down the steps alone with the flashlight and her phone, which still had 40% battery and a working camera. She spent 2 hours in the crypt. She photographed everything. The shelves, the wrapped bars from every angle, the markings on the bars she unwrapped one by one, the cloth they were wrapped in, which was heavy linen, aged but intact. She counted the bars again. 24, exactly as she had counted before. She photographed the wooden box, the brass clasp, the interior, the documents with their copperplate handwriting. She read the documents more carefully this time, all of them, going slowly through the language, some of it English, some of it Latin, parsing what she could. The list of items, as she had seen before, numbered 1 through 24, each with a weight in troy ounces and a brief description. The descriptions were consistent, aurum purum, pure gold, each one. The weights varied slightly, ranging from 210 to 247 troy ounces per bar. She did the math on her phone's calculator, working from the middle of that range. At 228 troy ounces average, 24 bars, 5,472 troy ounces total. At the current spot price, she had looked up at the library. The number that appeared on her calculator was $334 million. $334 million. She sat on the floor of the crypt with her phone in her hands, and the number on the screen, and the stone walls around her, and the sound of her own breathing, very loud in the sealed air. $334 million. She looked at the number for a long time. Then she closed the calculator and opened the camera and continued photographing. There was a second document beneath the list that she had only glanced at the day before. She read it carefully now. It was a letter, written in English, addressed to no one by name but beginning, "To whosoever receives this trust." It was dated the same day as the list, March 14th, 1889, and signed by a name, Sister Marguerite, Superior, Society of St. Agatha. The letter was short, 7 paragraphs. Delia read it twice. It explained that the gold had been brought from Belgium at the founding of the chapel, while entrusted to the society by an unnamed benefactor, described only as a servant of God, who sought to ensure that the work of the order would continue regardless of the circumstances of the world. It explained that the gold was to be held in the crypt and used only in the event of the complete dissolution of the order or the destruction of its mission, and only then for the continuation of charitable works among those in need. It explained that the location of the crypt and its contents had been recorded in the Society's archive in Belgium and would be known to the superior of the order at all times. And then, at the end, a sentence that Delia read 3 times before she understood it fully. Should the order dissolve entirely, leaving no living members and no active superior, that the gold is hereby consecrated to the purpose for which this chapel was built, the shelter and sustenance of those whom the world has forgotten. She sat with that sentence for a long time. The order had dissolved in 1962, more than 60 years ago. There were no living members, no active superior. The archive in Belgium, if it still existed, had apparently not resulted in anyone coming to claim this. The chapel had sat on Hollow Creek Road, with its echoing floor and its iron ring and its 24 bars of gold for 60 years. Waiting, Delia put her phone in her pocket, stood up, and looked around the crypt one last time. She thought about Sister Marguerite, writing by candlelight in 1889 in the language of permanence and trust, fun about a woman who had planned for the worst and hidden the means of survival in the floor of a chapel in Ohio. She thought about herself, packing 2 garbage bags that morning and driving without a direction. She thought about Camille saying, "Why does the floor echo?" She climbed the stairs. Outside, she could hear Camille working at the east window boards, the small grunt of effort, the creak of nails giving, a triumphant sound when one came free. Delia emerged into the chapel, slid the floor section back into place, moved the altar table, and went to the east wall, where a square of gray morning light was appearing as Camille removed the last board. "I got it," Camille announced from outside, flushed and triumphant, pry bar in both hands. "You got it," Delia agreed. The light that came through the east window was not direct. The clouds were too thick for that, but it was real light, full spectrum morning light, and it fell into the chapel and found the dust motes floating in the air and made them visible as a million small, bright things moving in the still space, and it reached the floor and illuminated the grain of the old oak and the colors thrown by the stained glass, the blue, the amber, the deep red pooling near the altar. Camille came back inside and stood in the light, looking up at the window she had freed. "It's better now," she said. "Much better," Delia agreed. Camille looked at her mother. At 7 years old, she was old enough to read faces, old enough to know that her mother looked different than she had yesterday, though she might not have had words for how. "Did you find something?" Camille asked. Delia looked at her daughter, or in the new light of the chapel they owned, standing above the crypt where the gold waited in the dark. "Yes," she said, "I found something." "Something good?" Delia took a breath. "Yes, baby," she said. "Something very good." The first person Delia told was a lawyer, and she chose him the way she chose everything in her life at that point, by elimination. She couldn't afford a private attorney, which ruled out most of them. She couldn't use legal aid because their intake process required a residential address, and she was living in a chapel with no utilities and no certificate of occupancy, which created a circular problem she didn't have the energy to untangle. What she could do was drive to the law school at Briar Falls Community College, which she had seen on her way through town, and ask whether they had a legal clinic. They did. Doi had met on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in a room that smelled of new carpet and ambition, staffed by third-year students, supervised by a professor named Gerald Okafor, who had practiced property law for 22 years before deciding he preferred teaching it. He was a tall man with reading glasses that he wore, pushed up on his forehead, until he actually needed them, at which point he pushed them down with the focused expression of someone engaging with a problem they find genuinely interesting. He found Delia's problem genuinely interesting. She had come prepared. She had printed the photographs of the crypt at the library, 23 pages of them on the library's 15 cents a page printer, which had cost her $3.45, and which she considered the best investment she had made in years, in second only to the $1 for the chapel. She had also printed the portions of property law she had been able to find online about found property and abandoned religious assets and ecclesiastical trusts. And she had organized everything in a folder she'd bought at the dollar store for 79 cents. She sat across from Professor Okafor and laid it out plainly. The chapel, the transfer, the crypt, what she had found, what the document said, what she thought it might mean. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up the photographs and went through them slowly, one by one, his glasses now on his nose. Then he set them down and looked at her over the frames. "You haven't removed anything from the crypt," he said. It was not quite a question. No. You haven't told anyone else. You're the first. He nodded slowly. "All right. Let me tell you what I know and what I don't know, and then we'll figure out what questions need answering." He took off his glasses and set them on the table. Found property law in Ohio is relatively straightforward when the property is genuinely abandoned, meaning the original owner has relinquished all claim, and there is no successor in interest. The complication here is the religious provenance. Assets held in ecclesiastical trust occupy a complicated legal space. They may be subject to canon law, civil trust law, or international agreement, depending on the nature of the trust and whether the originating organization had any surviving legal identity. The order dissolved in 1962, Delia said. I found a brief history online. No living members, so no active superior. That's the key question, Okafor said. Whether the dissolution was total, meaning the legal entity itself ceased to exist, or whether it was merged into another body, the diocese, the Vatican, some other Catholic organization. If the latter, that organization may have a successor claim. Delia looked at him steadily. And if the dissolution was total, then the letter you described, the one from Sister Marguerite, functions as a testamentary document, a trust instrument. If it specifies a purpose, and you've told me it specifies the shelter and sustenance of those whom the world has forgotten, and if the trustee organization no longer exists, then the question becomes, who has standing to fulfill that purpose? He paused. The most compelling argument would be that the person who found the trust was who holds the property and who represents the exact category of person the trust was established to serve, has the strongest claim to administer it. Delia let that sit for a moment. The strongest claim, she said, not an uncontested claim. Almost certainly not uncontested, he said. You're talking about a sum that, if your estimate is correct, exceeds $300 million. At that level, there will be parties who emerge to contest. The Diocese of Columbus will have an interest. The Belgian government may have an interest if the order held assets of cultural or historical significance. And depending on how this becomes public, you may attract private parties as well. He looked at her carefully. How you bring this forward matters enormously. The sequence of events, who learns about it in what order, what documentation you establish before anything becomes public. I understand, Delia said. I think you do, he said, and there was something in his voice, not surprise exactly, but recognition. He looked at the organized folder, the printed photographs, the highlighted legal research. You've been thorough. I've had to be thorough my whole life, Delia said. Things don't sort themselves out for people like me. He held her gaze for a moment. No, he said quietly. They don't. He agreed to take her case on a contingency basis, him and one of his third-year students, a young woman named Priya, who took notes with the intensity of someone who has already decided this is the case they'll talk about for the rest of their career. The arrangement was informal, operating within the bounds of the clinic's pro bono mandate, but Okafor made clear he intended to be thorough. Don't remove anything from the crypt, he told her again as she left. Don't tell anyone else, not family, not friends. Give me 2 weeks to research the legal history of the Society of St. Agatha and the status of the property under Ohio trust law. I can give you 2 weeks, Delia said. She drove back to Hollow Creek Road. Those 2 weeks were among the strangest of her life. She and Camille had established a routine in the chapel, the kind of routine that poverty forces you to develop, making a life out of what's available with no margin for what isn't. They slept in sleeping bags on 2 of the pews pushed together, which was more comfortable than the car had been, though not significantly warmer. Delia had bought 2 battery-powered lanterns and a propane camp stove, which she set up in the small room that had once been a vestry off the side of the nave, running the stove only when she was present to watch it. She had bought a 5-gallon water container, which she filled at the gas station every 2 days. She had found, in the woods behind the chapel, a small stream that ran clean and cold over limestone, and she told herself it was a sign, that old stone story of water and patience. Camille had not gone to school in 2 weeks, which weighed on Delia in a specific way, because Camille loved school with the wholehearted devotion of a child who finds the world genuinely interesting and wants to learn all of it as fast as possible. She was in 2nd grade and reading at a 5th grade level and had opinions about mathematics that her teacher, Mrs. Aldridge, who had described in the last parent conference as refreshingly unorthodox. Delia called the school from the gas station parking lot on the 2nd day and spoke to the office manager, a tired-voiced woman who sighed frequently and explained that they were going through a period of transition and she would have Camille back in class as soon as possible. The woman sighed and said she'd noted in the file and suggested that more than 10 consecutive absences would trigger a mandatory welfare check. Delia said she understood and thanked her and drove back to the chapel. That afternoon, she sat in the front pew with Camille, and they did 2 hours of school together, working through the math worksheets Delia had retrieved from the school office, and reading a chapter of the library book Camille had been in the middle of when everything changed. But Camille was wholly absorbed, her small brow furrowed over the page, occasionally reading sentences aloud to Gerald with the gravity of a professor lecturing. Watching her, Delia felt the particular ache of a parent who wants more for their child than they can currently provide, an ache so familiar it had almost lost its edges. almost. She went down to the crypt sometimes in the evenings, after Camille was asleep. Not to touch anything, not to take anything, just to be in the space. She would sit on the bottom step with the lantern and look at the shelves in the pale yellow light, at the cloth-wrapped shapes, at the wooden box on the stone table. And she would think. She thought about Sister Marguerite. She thought about what it meant to carry something precious through the world and to build a place for it to rest. She thought about the 4 owners before her who had somehow missed this. She turned that over repeatedly, trying to understand it. The floor echoed. The altar had been moved. The iron ring was there in the stone, visible if you crouched at the right angle. Had they not looked? Had they looked and not understood what they were hearing? Or had they understood and been afraid? Fear, she thought, was probably the answer. A person who found something like this and didn't have a clear legal path forward could be paralyzed by fear. The fear of getting it wrong, of having it taken, of the machinery of law and authority grinding down on them before they had a chance to establish their position. The fear was rational. She felt it herself, a low-grade hum beneath everything, a constant awareness that the thing she had found was extraordinary enough to attract extraordinary attention. And extraordinary attention had historically not been good for women who looked like her, who had as little as she had, who lived as she was currently living. But she had Okafor. She had Priya and her intense note-taking. She had the documentation she'd built, the photographs, the printed documents. She had, most importantly, the letter of Sister Marguerite, which she had come to think of as a key, not to the crypt, but to the argument, the legal and moral architecture that would determine whether what she had found became hers to use for the purpose it was intended. The shelter and sustenance of those whom the world has forgotten. She had been forgotten. She knew what that felt like from the inside. She knew its specific texture and temperature. She thought that probably qualified her. On the 8th day, Okafor called her cell phone at 10 in the morning. "I found the dissolution records," he said, without preamble, because he was that kind of man. The Society of St. Agatha formally dissolved in October 1962. The dissolution was complete. No merger, no successor organization. The final superior at the time of dissolution was a Sister Theodora Blessing, who died in 1978. The Belgian diocese was notified of the dissolution, but explicitly declined to assume any assets or liabilities, citing the order's status as an independent congregation not formally attached to the diocesan structure. He paused. The society had a legal archive in Bruges. That archive was transferred to the Belgian National Church Records in 1965 and has been in storage since. I've made contact with the archivist. The relevant file exists. It includes a reference to the Ohio property, and this is important, Delia, it includes a note dated 1963 from Sister Theodora stating that the Ohio Chapel's trust assets remain undisturbed and are committed to their original purpose per the founding instrument. Delia stood in the gas station parking lot, the phone pressed to her ear, watching a sparrow on the concrete near her feet. She knew, Delia said. She knew, and she chose not to disturb it. The note says, and I'm translating from French here, that the trust will fulfill itself when the world sends the right witness. The right witness. Delia closed her eyes for a moment. What does this mean, legally? She asked. It means the trust instrument is valid. The originating organization is fully dissolved with no successor claim, and the Belgian Archive's own documentation supports the interpretation that the trust was intended to remain until claimed by someone meeting the trust's stated purpose. Under Ohio law, combined with the federal religious land use statute and the common law doctrine of charitable cypress, the most defensible position is that you, as the property owner, and as a person, directly fitting the trust's beneficiary description, have the strongest possible claim to administer the trust. Another pause. I won't tell you it's certain. Nothing at this level is certain. But it's strong. It's genuinely strong. What do we do next? Delia asked. We file a quiet title action to confirm your ownership of the property and its contents, and simultaneously, we petition the court to recognize the trust instrument and appoint you as administrator. I want to have both filings ready before anything about this becomes public, because the moment it becomes public, the clock starts. How long? 2 weeks to prepare the filings. I want them airtight. All right, Delia said. Delia, Okafor said, and his voice had shifted slightly, moved from legal precision into something more human. Are you and your daughter safe? Are you managing? She looked at the sparrow, which had found a crumb near the air pump, and was investigating it with great seriousness. We're managing, she said. If you need anything in the meantime, let me know. She thanked him and hung up. She stood in the parking lot for a moment longer. Then she went inside and bought a bottle of apple juice and a bag of pretzels, and she drove back to the chapel on Hollow Creek Road. And when she got there, Camille was sitting on the front step in the morning light with Gerald and a library book, reading aloud to the rabbit in a voice of patient authority. Delia sat down beside her daughter on the step and handed her the apple juice. Camille took it without looking up from the book. Then she looked up. You look different again, Camille said. Do I? Like you did the day you found the thing. Delia looked at her daughter. Things are going well, she said carefully. Camille considered this. Are we going to have a house? Delia looked at the chapel behind them, at the limestone walls in the morning light, at the great oaks overhead, and at the iron gate still standing straight in the overgrown fence line. Better than a house, she said. Camille looked at the chapel thoughtfully. Can I have a real bed? Yes, baby. And a bathroom? Yes. Camille returned to her book. Okay, she said, in the tone of someone who has decided a negotiation is satisfactorily concluded. The trouble began not from a lawyer or a government office or a church authority. It began from closer in, the way trouble for women like Delia almost always did. Her sister Renee called on a Wednesday, which was unusual because Renee called on Sundays, that being the day she had designated for family obligation, in the organized way she designated everything. When Delia's phone showed Renee's name on a Wednesday, she almost didn't answer. She answered. Someone from the county called me, Renee said immediately. She always began conversations in the middle, as though the preamble had already happened in her head, and she was simply reporting the conclusion. A welfare check. They said Camille hasn't been in school in 2 weeks. Delia. What is going on? Delia explained the outline of it, carefully. The chapel, the transfer, the work she was doing to make it habitable. She said nothing about the crypt. She said nothing about the gold. Renee was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You bought a chapel. I acquired it through a legal property transfer. For $1. Yes, Delia. Renee's voice had that quality it always got, that mixture of love and exasperation and a kind of superior sorrow that made Delia's jaw tighten. I know you're trying. I know things have been hard. But this isn't a solution. A condemned chapel in the middle of nowhere is not a home for a 7-year-old child. You need to let me help you. Come to Columbus. Stay on my couch while you get back on your feet. I know it's not ideal, but it's not condemned, Delia said. The township assessment flagged structural concerns. That's different from condemned. The walls are solid limestone, Renee. They have been standing for 138 years, and they will be standing when we're both gone. A pause. You sound like you've lost perspective on this. I sound like I know what I'm doing. Another pause, longer. I just don't want to see you get hurt. You and Camille. I know, Delia said, and she kept her voice even because Renee loved her. She knew that. Loved her in the way of people who love you and also believe you are not quite capable of the things you're attempting, which is its own particular burden. I need 2 more weeks, then I'll explain everything properly. Just, please, don't push on the welfare check situation. I'm handling it. Camille is fine. She's sitting outside reading to a stuffed rabbit. Renee exhaled. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. After she hung up, Delia went inside and sat with the unease that conversation always left in her. She thought about Renee's apartment in Columbus, neat and organized, everything in its proper category. She thought about the couch she'd been offered, which she had slept on for 3 weeks 6 years ago after her marriage ended, and which had felt like charity with dimensions, and a charity that came with a shape and a time limit and an unspoken accounting of what was owed for it. She thought about the crypt. She thought about $334 million lying in the dark under the altar of a chapel she owned. And she thought about all the years she had been offered smaller things in the place of real things, and had been expected to be grateful, and had sometimes been grateful, because smaller things were still things, and you couldn't always hold out for real things. But she had always known the difference. This was a real thing. She was going to hold out for it. The complications multiplied in the way complications do, not catastrophically, but steadily, the way water finds cracks. On the 14th day, Okafor called with the filings ready and a date set for the initial hearing, now which would be before Judge Marianne Costello of the Briar Falls County Court of Common Pleas. He also told her that the Diocese of Columbus had filed a notice of interest with the court that morning. How did they know? Delia asked. The court filing becomes a matter of public record the moment it's entered, Okafor said. The diocese monitors religious property matters in the county. They moved fast. What does this mean? It means they will intervene in the proceeding. Their claim will likely rest on the argument that the assets of any dissolved Catholic order revert to the local diocese by virtue of canon law and the implied terms of ecclesiastical governance. It's a standard argument, and it has succeeded in some jurisdictions. A pause. It has not always succeeded, so particularly when the originating organization's own documentation explicitly states a civil trust purpose that supersedes institutional reversion. Sister Marguerite's letter. Exactly. The letter is your strongest counter. It demonstrates that the founding superior deliberately framed this as a civil charitable trust with a specific beneficiary purpose, not as institutional assets subject to hierarchical reversion. The Belgian archive documentation supports this reading. And Judge Costello? I know her reputation. She is thorough, and she is fair. She will want to understand the full history before ruling, which means this will not be resolved immediately. We're looking at weeks, possibly months. Months. Delia stood in the vestry of the chapel and looked at the camp stove and the water container and the 2 sleeping bags rolled up in the corner. I need to be able to live here legally, she said. Before anything else, Camille needs to be back in school. The quiet title action establishes your ownership. The building department issue is separate. You'd need to engage a licensed contractor to conduct a structural assessment and obtain a temporary certificate of occupancy, which under Ohio code can be issued for a structure undergoing renovation if it meets minimum habitability standards. What are minimum habitability standards? He listed them. Structural integrity of the primary walls and roof, which the limestone walls provided. A source of potable water, which the gas station runs provided temporarily. A functional sanitation facility, which they did not have. An emergency egress. Smoke and carbon monoxide detection. The sanitation facility was the obstacle. She needed a portable toilet at minimum, or a connection to a septic system, and even a portable toilet required a permit from the county. She spent $320 on a portable sanitation unit and the permit for it, which left her account at $61. It was worth it. With the portable unit in place and the rest of the checklist met, Okafor walked a building inspector named Dale Winters through the chapel on a Thursday morning. Winters was a compact man who wore his skepticism openly, moving through the nave with his clipboard held slightly away from his body, as though the building's condition might be contagious. He knocked on walls. He tested floor planks. He examined the ceiling joints of the nave. He spent a long time in the bell tower, which Delia had blocked off with a chain and a caution sign. He came back down and wrote on his clipboard. "Structure is sounder than it looks," he said finally, without enthusiasm. "Primary limestone walls are excellent. The east wall has some deep pointing needed, but nothing that affects load-bearing capacity. Roof is your problem. 3 sections need immediate repair before winter." He looked at his clipboard. "I can issue a temporary CO for the nave and vestry as habitable space, excluding the bell tower and the rear vestibule. Valid for 90 days. Renewable if repair work is ongoing." He issued it that afternoon. Camille went back to school the following Monday. Delia drove her in the Nissan, watching her daughter walk through the doors of Briar Falls Elementary with her backpack and her library book, and Gerald tucked into the top of the bag, his ears sticking out. She watched until Camille disappeared inside. Then she sat in the parking lot for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel. She had a legal address. She had a temporary certificate of occupancy. Her daughter was back in school. The court proceedings had begun. Okafor's filings were in, and the diocese had entered its counterclaim, and Judge Costello had set an initial hearing for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks. She drove back to the chapel. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in early May in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Briar Falls County Courthouse, a building that smelled of institution and time, and the particular smell of decisions being made in rooms with dropped ceilings and fluorescent lighting. Delia wore the best clothes she owned, which were not, by the standards of courtroom attendance, particularly impressive. Dark slacks and a gray blouse she had ironed twice. She had borrowed a blazer from the college clinic's lost and found box, a dark blue one that fit well enough. Okafor wore a good suit and the expression of someone who had done this many times and knew exactly how to stand still while the other side made their opening arguments. The diocese was represented by an attorney named Franklin Wells, who was everything the setting would have predicted, silver-haired and smooth in a charcoal suit, speaking in the measured cadences of someone who has never had to search for a word in his life. For he outlined the diocese's position with the confidence of someone laying down a hand he considers unbeatable. Ecclesiastical assets, he argued, were subject to canon law's principle of hierarchical communion. Assets of a dissolved order, regardless of the order's independent status, reverted to the local diocese as a matter of settled religious governance. The gold in the crypt of St. Agatha's chapel had been placed there by members of the Catholic faith, in a Catholic structure, and its natural legal home was the institution of the Catholic Church as represented by the Diocese of Columbus. He did not mention Sister Marguerite's letter specifically, but he gestured toward it, calling it a private document with no standing in civil law, an expression of personal intent by a deceased individual that could not override the governance structures of a living institution. He sat down. Okafor stood up. He was quieter than Wells, which was intentional, Delia understood. He let the room settle before he spoke. Then he laid out his argument with the methodical precision of a man who has spent 22 years knowing exactly which stone to place where. The Society of St. Agatha, he began, was not merely a congregation of the Catholic Church. It was an independent contemplative order, incorporated under Belgian civil law in 1861, with its own legal identity separate from the diocesan structure. This was not a matter of religious interpretation. It was a matter of documented legal fact, and he had the Belgian incorporation documents to prove it, obtained from the Bruges archive, entered into the record. The dissolution of the society in 1962 was a complete dissolution of a civil legal entity. The diocese had been notified and had explicitly declined successor status, a fact documented in the diocese's own records from that year, which Priya had somehow obtained through a FOIA request that Delia still didn't fully understand, but was deeply grateful for. The diocese could not now claim successor rights to assets they had formally disclaimed 60 years earlier. The trust instrument, the letter of Sister Marguerite dated March 1889, was not merely a private document. It was a founding instrument of a civil charitable trust, executed by the legal superior of an incorporated civil organization, designating a specific beneficiary purpose. Under Ohio charitable trust law, such an instrument had standing. The question before the court was not whether the trust was valid, but whether the beneficiary purpose had been met, and whether the court would recognize the current property owner, a woman who fit precisely within the trust's beneficiary language, as the administrator of that purpose. He sat down. Judge Costello looked at both attorneys for a long moment over her reading glasses. She was a woman in her late 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and the focused stillness of someone who has learned to think before she speaks, which Delia had been told was a good sign. "I'm going to need independent verification of the physical contents of the crypt," Judge Costello said. "I'm appointing a court expert, a certified appraiser, and a historian of religious artifacts to assess and document what is present, on the record. Before this proceeding goes further, both parties will have access to the findings." She looked at Delia directly for the first time. "Ms. Marsh, you will permit access to the property for this assessment?" "Yes, Your Honor," Delia said. "Good. We'll reconvene in 3 weeks." She looked at both attorneys. "I'll tell you now that I find the question of ecclesiastical reversion to a diocese that formally disclaimed successor status to be a significant legal hurdle for the claimant institution. I'll also tell you that I find the question of charitable trust administration under the terms of a 130-year-old instrument to be a complex one that will require careful examination. Come back with everything you have." She stood, and the room stood with her. 3 weeks. Outside the courthouse, in the thin May sunshine, Sir Okafor stood beside Delia on the steps and looked at the street. "That went well," he said. She seemed skeptical of the diocese. She was. The disclaimer documentation was the right move. Priya did exceptional work finding it. He looked at Delia. "The appraisal will be definitive. Once the value is on the record, the stakes will be formally established, and everyone will understand what they're contesting." "How much attention will that bring?" He was quiet for a moment. "A great deal," he said honestly. "I won't pretend otherwise. Once a formal court record exists with numbers like these, it becomes a matter of public record. Reporters, other potential claimants, people with theories." He looked at her steadily. "Are you prepared for that?" Delia looked down the courthouse steps at the ordinary street, at the people moving along it, who had no idea what was happening 3 floors above them, at the Nissan parked at the meter with the cracked taillight that she hadn't been able to afford to fix. "I've been preparing my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know what for." The court-appointed experts arrived at the chapel the following Thursday. 2 of them, a woman named Dr. Lena Hartwick, who was a specialist in religious artifacts and medieval through modern ecclesiastical holdings, and a man named Joseph Tron, who was a certified appraiser with a specialty in precious metals and historical collections. They came with a 3rd person, a court officer who would document the chain of custody, and a photographer who worked for the court. Delia let them in. She had cleaned the chapel in the days before their arrival, not to conceal anything, but because she had a particular feeling about what was owed to this space, and allowing strangers to see it in disarray felt like a small betrayal of it. The pews were dusted. The floor was swept. She had replaced the boards in the east window that had come loose again, though she left the one Camille had pried free, because that window now had light coming through it, and she wasn't willing to board it back up. She led them to the altar. She moved it herself, the same way she had moved it the first time, hands flat on the wood, leaning her weight against it. She removed the floor section. She stood at the top of the steps. Dr. Hartwick descended first, with her flashlight and her camera and the careful movements of someone entering a space they understand to be significant. Now Joseph Tran followed with a scale and measuring tools. The court officer and photographer came last. Delia waited at the top of the stairs. She listened to the sounds from below, the murmuring of voices, the click of cameras, the occasional brief silence that she had come to associate with a person encountering something that stops the ordinary flow of thought. After 40 minutes, Dr. Hartwick came back up the stairs. She stood beside Delia at the altar and looked at her with an expression that Delia read carefully. "Ms. Marsh," she said, "I need you to understand that I have examined religious artifacts in churches, museums, and private collections across Europe and North America for 31 years. She paused. "What is in that crypt is one of the most significant ecclesiastical treasure finds I have personally encountered. The gold is authentic. The bars are consistent with Belgian mint production of the late 1880s. The documents are genuine and in remarkable condition. The cross markings on the bars match those of a Belgian monastic foundry that operated in Bruges from 1810 to 1903. She looked at Delia steadily. "Do you understand what you found?" "I'm beginning to," Delia said. Dr. Hartwick nodded slowly. The Order of St. Agatha was very small and very obscure. Most scholars of religious history have never heard of them. The fact that their archive in Bruges survived is almost miraculous. The fact that this crypt survived intact, sealed, undisturbed for 135 years. She stopped. "In 31 years, I have never seen anything like this." Joseph Tran came up the stairs 20 minutes later. He had weighed each bar individually. He had taken dimensions. He had done his calculations on a tablet he carried, the numbers moving on the screen in the lamplight of the crypt. He stood beside Delia and showed her his findings without speaking. Just turned the tablet so she could see the screen. The number was slightly higher than her library calculation. $334,800,000, almost exactly what she had estimated. She looked at the number on the screen and then looked at the chapel around her, the stone walls, the old pews, the colored light from the stained glass, the woman in blue at the front. Joseph Tran said quietly, "In 20 years of appraisal work, I have never been on a residential discovery like this one." "It's not residential," Delia said. "It's a chapel." "Yes," he said. "I know." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating his understanding of the day he'd expected to have. "Ma'am," he said, "however this legal proceeding resolves, I want you to know that what you found is extraordinary. The preservation alone is extraordinary. Someone cared very much about this." "Sister Marguerite cared about it," Delia said. He nodded. "She did." After they left, Delia went down into the crypt alone. She sat on the bottom step with the lantern and looked at the shelves. The bars were back in their places, the cloth rewrapped around each one, the wooden box on the stone table with its clasp closed. The court experts had been careful and respectful, had returned everything to its position with a deliberateness that felt appropriate. The air was the same as always. Cool, dry mineral, the smell of something deep. She thought about Sister Marguerite writing at a desk in 1889 in a young chapel in Ohio, far from Belgium, sealing her instructions in a box, and placing it above gold that had traveled across the Atlantic. She thought about what faith it required to seal something away and trust that the right witness would come. She thought about Camille saying, "Why does the floor echo?" She thought about all the things she had tried and failed at in the years before this. The job that ended in a manila envelope, the apartment she'd lost, the couch in Columbus she'd refused, the grant applications that came back as rejections, the landlord who'd called twice, the supervisor who couldn't meet her eyes. All of it had led here. Every closed door had been a direction. She sat in the cool silence for a long time. Then she climbed the stairs, slid the floor section back into place, moved the altar table, and went to the front pew and sat down. The colored light from the stained glass lay across the floor in its usual patterns, blue and amber and red. She picked up her phone and called Okafor. "The appraisal is done," she said. "And?" $334,800,000. A brief silence. "All right," he said. "Then we go back to court and we win this." "Yes," Delia said. "We do." The 3 weeks between the first hearing and the second were not quiet. Delia had known they wouldn't be, but she had not known exactly what shape the noise would take. It began with a reporter, a young man from the Briar Falls Gazette named Tom Ellery, who had apparently been watching the courthouse filing database and had matched the quiet title action with the chapel address and done enough research to understand that something significant was being disputed. He called her cell phone on a Saturday morning while she was making instant oatmeal on the camp stove. She didn't take his call. She didn't take the second call or the third. But on Monday, when she was picking up Camille from school, he was waiting by the gate, notebook in hand, the slightly breathless look of a young reporter who has found his story. "Ms. Marsh," he said, "can you confirm that you're the claimant in the St. Agatha's chapel proceeding?" "No comment," Delia said. "Is it true that—" "No comment," she said again, firmly but without heat. Godoin took Camille's hand and walked to the Nissan. Camille looked up at her as they walked. "Who was that?" "A reporter." Camille considered this. "Are you famous?" "No," Delia said. "Not yet." She called Okafor from the car. He had expected this. He told her to continue declining comment, to not engage with any media, to document every approach. He had already prepared a statement for if the story broke publicly, which it would, probably within the week. He was right. The Gazette ran a story on Wednesday. It was short and imprecise, working from what Ellery had been able to piece together without her cooperation. It mentioned a disputed property claim involving a chapel, a significant financial sum, and a homeless woman who had acquired the property for $1. It did not have the number. It did not have the details of the crypt, but it had enough. By Thursday, the Columbus Dispatch had picked it up. By Friday, 3 television stations had called. Renee called 4 times. Delia answered the 4th time. "Is this real?" Renee said immediately. "The newspaper. Is this real? I told you I had something to explain in 2 weeks. It's been 3 weeks. Things took slightly longer than anticipated." Renee was quiet for a long moment. "Delia, they're saying hundreds of millions of dollars." "It's possible," Delia said. Another silence. When Renee spoke again, her voice had changed. The texture of it shifted from the familiar older sister register into something less certain of itself. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed to handle it correctly. Because telling people before I had legal standing established would have created problems." She paused. "Because I needed to do this on my own." A long silence. "I told you to come to Columbus," Renee said finally, and her voice was so quiet now it was almost inaudible. "I told you to sleep on my couch. I know you did. And instead I listened to the floor echo," Delia said. The second hearing drew a different crowd to the courthouse. The gallery, which had been empty at the first hearing, except for Priya, and the court officer, was now half full. Tom Ellery from the Gazette was there with a more senior colleague. 2 television cameras waited in the hall outside, not permitted in the courtroom itself. Franklin Wells of the diocese had 2 junior attorneys with him now. Okafor brought the appraisal findings, Dr. Hartwick's expert report, the Belgian incorporation documents, the diocese's 1962 disclaimer, and Sister Marguerite's letter, the original of which was now in a protective sleeve obtained from a museum conservation supply company because Okafor had strong opinions about evidence preservation. Judge Costello read into the record the appraisal findings. When she said the number, there was a sound in the gallery, not quite a gasp, something more controlled than that, a collective adjustment. She then addressed both counsels with the precision of someone who has done her reading. "I've reviewed the full record," she said. "The diocese's claim rests on a canon law principle of hierarchical reversion. But canon law is not civil law, and this court operates under civil law. The diocese declined successor status in 1962. That declination is documented in their own institutional records. You cannot disclaim an estate and then reclaim it 60 years later when its contents prove more valuable than anticipated." She looked at Wells evenly. "The Sister Marguerite instrument is a valid civil charitable trust under Ohio law. It has a designated purpose. The question is whether that purpose has been met." She looked at Delia. "Ms. Marsh," she said, "you are a single mother who recently experienced involuntary housing loss. You acquired this property legally. You discovered its contents through your own initiative and documented them responsibly. You engaged legal counsel and pursued the correct procedural path rather than acting unilaterally." She paused. "The trust language specifies the shelter and sustenance of those whom the world has forgotten. In my reading of that language and your circumstances, you fit squarely within its terms." Wells was on his feet. "Your Honor, with respect, the claimant's circumstances are sympathetic, but cannot substitute for—" "Sit down, Mr. Wells," Judge Costello said without raising her voice. "I'm not finished." He sat. "I'm not ruling from sympathy," the judge continued. "I'm ruling from the law. The diocese's claim fails on the declination precedent and on the civil incorporation status of the originating organization. The trust instrument is valid. The beneficiary purpose is met." She looked at both sides. "I am granting the quiet title action in favor of Ms. Delia Marsh. I am recognizing the charitable trust instrument and appointing Ms. Marsh as administrator of the trust with authority to apply its assets in accordance with the founding purpose, which I am interpreting broadly to include the immediate and long-term welfare of the administrator and her dependents, and the continuation of charitable works consistent with the order's stated mission." She closed the folder in front of her. "The contents of the crypt of St. Agatha's Chapel are the legal property of Delia Marsh as trust administrator, effective today. The diocese's claim is dismissed." She looked at Wells once more. "You may appeal, of course." "We will," Wells said tightly. "I expect you will," Judge Costello said, with the equanimity of someone who has been appealed before and has survived it. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. Delia sat very still. Okafor sat beside her and said nothing for a moment, letting the sound of the gavel settle into the air of the room. Then he turned to her. "That was the right judge," he said quietly. "Yes," Delia agreed. "The appeal will likely fail. The diocese precedent on the disclaimer is airtight." "Yes." He looked at her carefully. "Are you all right?" She thought about that question for a moment. Outside the courtroom doors, she could hear the sound of the hallway, the movement of people, the voices of the reporters, who were already asking each other questions they would shortly redirect toward her. She thought about the morning she had packed the 2 garbage bags, the mailbox, the dollar store folder, the library terminal, the camp stove in the vestry, Camille sweeping the nave with the rusted broom and declaring it smelled like old books. She thought about Sister Marguerite, 137 years ago, writing by candlelight. To whosoever receives this trust. Yes, Delia said. I'm all right. She stood up. She picked up her blazer from the chair beside her, the borrowed one from the clinic's lost and found, dark blue, fitting well enough. She walked to the courtroom doors. Outside, the cameras turned toward her, and the reporters raised their notebooks, and the ordinary machinery of a world suddenly paying attention began to move. She stood in the hallway of the Briar Falls County Courthouse and looked at all of them looking at her. All of these people who had not been there on Ridley Street, who had not seen the 2 garbage bags, who had not heard the echo in the floor of a chapel that nobody wanted. She thought about what to say. Then she thought about Camille, who would be getting out of school in 2 hours, who would be picked up by her mother in a Nissan with a cracked taillight, who would come home to a chapel on Hollow Creek Road and ask if they were going to have a real bed now. Ms. Marsh, Tom Ellery said, pressing forward with his notebook. Can you tell us what happened in there? Delia looked at him. We won, she said simply. She walked through them to the elevator. The world does not change overnight when you win. That is one of the things nobody tells you, perhaps because it doesn't make a satisfying story, or perhaps because the people who write the stories have never actually won anything from a position of nothing, and so they don't know that winning is not an event, but a process, slow and complicated and full of paperwork. Delia learned this in the weeks that followed Judge Costello's ruling, weeks that were simultaneously the most extraordinary and the most exhausting of her life. The gold could not simply be taken out of the crypt and exchanged for money. It had to be transported by a licensed precious metals carrier under court supervision, which required a motion and an order and a bond. It had to be assayed by an independent refinery before sale, which required another set of documents and a chain of custody record that traced each bar from the stone shelf where Sister Marguerite had placed it to the hands of the buyer. It had to be sold through a process that satisfied the court's oversight of the trust administration. Because Okafor had structured the appointment carefully, Delia was the administrator of a charitable trust, and while that gave her broad authority over the assets, it also meant that every transaction was technically a matter of record. None of this bothered her. She had always worked within processes. She had always navigated systems that were not built for her. The paperwork was dense, but it was navigable, and she had Okafor and Priya, who by this point had the focused energy of someone who understood they were in the middle of something they would spend the rest of their professional life referencing. The diocese filed its appeal on the 14th day after the ruling, as Franklin Wells had promised. Okafor reviewed the brief and called Delia on a Tuesday morning while she was driving Camille to school. It's what I expected, he said. They're pressing the canon law argument and adding a new theory that the trust instrument fails for indefiniteness. The beneficiary class is too vague. It's a reach. Judge Costello's ruling was well-reasoned, and the appellate court will see that. He paused. It will take 4 to 6 months to be heard. In the meantime, the ruling stands. The assets are yours to administer. Good, Delia said. Are you comfortable with the sale process as we've structured it? Yes. The first tranche will clear your account within 30 days of the initial transfer. She pulled into the school parking lot. Camille was already unbuckling her seatbelt with the efficiency of a child who has places to be. 30 days, Delia said. 30 days, he confirmed. She watched Camille climb out of the car with her backpack and her library book, and Gerald's ears sticking out of the top of the bag. Her daughter turned at the gate and waved back at her with the particular wave of a 7-year-old who is simultaneously fully present and already thinking about something else. Delia waved back, 30 days. And she drove back to Hollow Creek Road. The first thing she did with the money, before anything else, before any of the things that needed doing, and the long list of things she had told herself she would do when she had the means, was buy Camille a bed. She drove to a furniture store on Route 12, a place she had passed many times in the years before and had never gone into, because furniture stores were for people who had floors to put furniture on and stability to justify it. She walked through the door on a Wednesday morning with a credit card that now had an actual available balance on it, a fact so new she had checked the app twice before leaving the chapel. She found a bed with a white frame and a headboard with a small carved detail of leaves, and a mattress that the salesman described as medium firm and excellent for growing children. And she bought the frame, the mattress, the box spring, the mattress cover, the sheets in Camille's color, which was a specific shade of green that Camille called the color of new things, and 2 pillows. She arranged for delivery that Saturday. On Saturday morning, when the delivery truck came up Hollow Creek Road, and the 2 men carried the pieces of the bed frame through the chapel door, Camille stood in the nave and watched with an expression of absolute seriousness, as though witnessing an event of historical significance, which in the context of her 7 years it was. They set it up in the vestry, which was the right size for a child's room, with the window that looked out into the oaks. Delia had cleaned the room thoroughly, patched the plaster walls, hung a curtain made from fabric she'd found at the dollar store, was a print of small blue flowers on white over the window. When the men left, Camille walked into the vestry and stood looking at the bed. She walked around it once. She pressed her hand into the mattress. She picked up one of the green pillows and examined it. She set Gerald on the pillow, adjusting him carefully until he was positioned to her satisfaction. Then she climbed onto the bed and lay down on her back and looked at the ceiling. She was quiet for a long moment. "Mama," she said. "Yes, baby." "This is the best bed I have ever had." It was the only bed she had ever had, properly speaking. The previous sleeping arrangements in their life having included the mattress on the floor on Ridley Street, the back seat of the Nissan, and the pews pushed together in the nave. But Delia didn't say that. "I know," she said. Camille looked at the ceiling for another moment. "Can we put stars up there?" she said. "The kind that glow." "Yes," Delia said. "We can put stars up there." She sat on the edge of the bed while Camille fell asleep that first night, in the chapel on Hollow Creek Road, in the room that smelled of old stone and new plaster and the clean, sharp scent of fresh sheets, listening to the oaks move in the dark outside the window. The sound was different inside now, more contained, more particular, the sound of a place that was becoming a home rather than a shelter. She thought about all the nights before this one, the nights on Ridley Street with the radiator knocking and the walls the color of old teeth. The night she had packed the bags and known it was the last night. The nights in the car with Camille breathing in the back seat, and small and trusting. The nights in the pews, in the sleeping bags, listening to the chapel settle around them. She sat in the dark beside her sleeping daughter and let all of it be present at once, not as trauma, not as something to get past, but as the actual material of her life, the ground beneath everything that had happened and was now happening. She had not been broken by any of it. She had been brought here by it. The restoration of the chapel began in June. Delia had spent 3 weeks thinking carefully about what she wanted, and what she wanted was not a renovation in the sense of changing what the chapel was, but a restoration, returning it to what it had been at its best, and then making it inhabitable and useful in a way that honored that history. She hired a contractor named Paul Dembski, who had been restoring old buildings in Briar Falls for 30 years, and who came to the chapel on a Monday morning and walked through it slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, the way a person walks through a space they are reading. He tested the limestone walls, examined the roof structure from the outside and the inside, climbed up to the bell tower, and spent 20 minutes up there, in a silence that Delia had learned to read as the silence of a person, thinking seriously. When he came down, he stood in the nave and looked at the stained glass at the front, the woman in blue with her 2 cracks and her long-ago tape repair. "Who was she?" he asked. "St. Agatha," Delia said. He nodded. "Good bones," he said, which she had come to understand was his version of the highest praise. "The limestone is excellent. The bell tower needs significant work, but it's savable. The roof is the priority. 3 sections need full replacement. The rest needs repointing and flashing." He turned slowly, taking in the whole space. "The floor is remarkable. Old-growth oak, every plank. I don't know where they sourced it in 1887, but you couldn't buy this quality now." "I know," Delia said. He gave her a quote that was substantial, but fair, and she accepted it. And work began the following week. She had one instruction for Paul Dembski that she delivered on the first day of work, standing in the nave with the sound of his crew beginning on the roof above them. "The floor," she said. "I want it preserved exactly as it is. Every plank. No replacement unless a plank is actually unsafe. The gaps, the color variation, the wear patterns. All of it stays." He looked at her. "Most people want the floor refinished," he said. "I'm not most people," she said. He almost smiled. "No," he said. "You're not." The floor stayed. While the restoration was underway, Delia moved forward on the other things, the longer list, the one she had been keeping in her head for years, without knowing exactly what it was a list for. She established a legal entity, a non-profit organization called the St. Agatha Trust for Community Relief, which Okafor structured carefully to satisfy the court's oversight requirements, and to position the trust's charitable giving in a way that was defensible and transparent. The trust would distribute a portion of the gold's value annually to organizations serving people experiencing housing insecurity in Briar Falls County. It would fund a scholarship program at Briar Falls Community College, and it would support the ongoing maintenance of the chapel as a community space. She kept the remainder, which was still a number that seemed to belong to a different category of reality than any she had previously inhabited, under careful financial management, arranged through a fiduciary Okafor recommended, a woman named Sandra Park, who managed charitable estates and who came to the chapel on a Tuesday afternoon and sat across from Delia at the altar table, which Delia had repurposed as a desk, and went through the numbers with the calm precision of someone who finds large sums neither impressive nor threatening. "You'll want to think about a foundation structure long-term," Sandra said. "Perpetual endowment, self-sustaining. If you invest the principal correctly, the trust can operate indefinitely without depleting the corpus. I want it to last longer than I do," Delia said. "That's the right thinking." Sandra made a note. "And your personal allocation? For your household and your daughter's future?" Delia had thought about this carefully. She had thought about it in the way she thought about most things, methodically, from the edges in, ruling out the things that didn't fit before settling on what did. She had thought about the numbers she used to watch, the balance in her checking account, the gap between what came in and what went out, the specific, grinding mathematics of a life at the margin. She had thought about what enough felt like from the inside, and she had discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that enough had a very specific shape, not infinite, not spectacular, but solid, permanent, free of the particular fear that had been the background noise of her life for so long she had almost stopped hearing it. She told Sandra the number. Sandra looked at her over her reading glasses. "That's considerably more conservative than what most people in your position elect." "I know what I need," Delia said. I've always known what I need. I just didn't always have it." Sandra made another note. "All right," she said. "I can work with that." The appellate court heard the diocese's appeal in September, 4 months after Judge Costello's ruling. Delia did not attend the hearing. She and Okafor had discussed it and agreed that her presence added nothing legally, and the optics of the thing. She was beyond needing to perform her case for anyone. Okafor went with Priya, who had by this point passed the bar and was formally practicing, her first real case being, in Delia's estimation, a fairly significant one to begin with. The ruling came down 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday in October, while Delia was supervising the installation of the repaired stained glass. A conservator named Maria Chen, whom Dr. Hartwick had recommended, had spent 3 weeks removing the window, piece by piece, repairing the 2 cracks with an invisible process involving UV-cured adhesive and matching glass from a conservation supplier, and had rehung it that morning. Delia was standing in the nave watching the light come through the restored window, the colors falling clean and true across the floor, blue and amber and deep red, all of them sharp now, precise, when her phone buzzed. Okafor's number. "No, the appeal is dismissed," he said. Unanimous. The panel found the canon law argument legally insufficient under civil jurisdiction and the indefiniteness theory meritless. The ruling stands. Delia looked at the light on the floor. "It's over," she said. "The diocese can petition the Supreme Court of Ohio," he said, "but I don't believe they will. The record is clear, and the cost of further litigation is not justified by the strength of their position." He paused. "It's over, Delia." She stood in the nave for a moment after she hung up, looking at the restored window, at the woman in blue whole again, her colors deep and accurate in the October light. The chapel around her was in the final stages of restoration, the roof complete, the bell tower stabilized, the walls repointed, the floor preserved and gently cleaned, but not altered. Oh, every plank in place, the gap still there, the wear pattern still there, the echo still there when you walked near the altar end. She walked to the center of the nave and stood still and listened. The floor echo was still there. She could feel it faintly in the boards beneath her feet, the resonance moving down through the oak, through the stone below, into the space beneath, the crypt that was now empty, the bars transported and sold and converted into numbers in a trust account, but the space itself still there, still hollow, still present. She thought about Camille asking, "Why does the floor echo?" She thought about the answer she had given. Empty rooms echo. But the crypt wasn't empty, because it was empty. It had been full of gold and documents and a century of waiting. And the echo had been the sound of all that fullness pressing up through the floor, the sound of something that had somewhere to go and was patient about getting there. She stood in the nave and felt the echo and thought that it was the right sound for a place like this. The news broke in a way she had not quite anticipated, which was to say all at once and from every direction. The appellate ruling was a matter of public record, and with it, the full details of the case entered the broader information stream that the internet made inevitable. By Thursday morning, the story had been picked up by 3 major wire services. By Friday, it was on national television. By Saturday, her phone had received 412 calls from numbers she didn't recognize, which she did not answer, and 17 from people she knew, which she answered selectively. The story the media told was accurate in its broad outline and inaccurate in most of its texture, as media stories generally are. It described her as a homeless woman, which had been true when she found the chapel, but was not true now, and which she found reductive in the way that single-word descriptions of complex circumstances always are. It described the gold as a treasure, which was technically accurate and spiritually wrong, because treasure implied something lucky, something stumbled upon, and she had not stumbled. She had listened. She had looked at a floor that echoed and thought about why floors echo. She had crouched beside an altar table and noticed an iron ring that had been there for 135 years, waiting for someone to notice it. The stories didn't have room for that kind of detail. She understood. She read them and set them aside. What she could not set aside were the people. They came in two categories. The first category was people who wanted something. Journalists, a documentary filmmaker who drove from Columbus and sat outside the chapel gate for 2 days before she finally went out and told him politely, but clearly, that she was not interested. 3 different book agents who found her address somehow and sent letters. A man who called from Los Angeles claiming to represent a production company and used phrases like incredible story and limited series, and we'd love to develop this with you, as though her life were a product available for licensing. She declined all of them, quietly and consistently, because she had learned in the past months that the energy she gave to managing other people's interest in her situation was energy she wasn't giving to the situation itself. The second category was harder to set aside because it was people she knew. Her mother called from Dayton on a Saturday morning. Her mother, whose house had room but not enough grace, who had a way of loving her children that involved a continuous low-grade audit of their decisions. Her mother, who had told her 17 years ago that marrying a man who drove a nice car but had no savings was a mistake, which had been correct, and who had been mentioning it ever since, in the way of people who are right about one thing and never stop using it. Delia answered. I saw it on the news, her mother said. I know. The chapel. A pause. You bought a chapel for $1. Yes. Another pause. I should have known, her mother said. Known what? That when you went quiet, you were doing something. She made a sound that Delia had heard all her life and had spent most of her life trying to interpret and had finally understood was her mother's version of admiration, a sound halfway between a sigh and a hum. You were always doing things quiet, even when you were small. Delia sat down on one of the pews. I learned that from you, she said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Camille, she said. Is she all right? She's wonderful. She has a real bed and glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling, and she's reading 3 levels above her grade, and she has decided she wants to be an architect when she grows up. An architect, her mother said. Oh, she wants to build things that last, Delia said. She says buildings that last are more important than buildings that look nice. Her mother made the sound again. Smart child. She is, Delia said. I'd like to see her, her mother said carefully, in the way of someone who is asking a question disguised as a statement, which was how her mother had always asked for things she wasn't sure she had the right to ask for. Come for Thanksgiving, Delia said. Both of you, you and Aunt Mabel. There's room. A pause. In the chapel? In the chapel, Delia said. It's being restored. By the time you come, it'll have a proper kitchen and 2 guest rooms in the back, where the old storage rooms are. She looked around the nave at the cleaned stone, the repaired roof visible through the gap where one of Paul Dembski's crew was finishing the last section of flashing. It's beautiful, Mama. It's really beautiful. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. I'll come, she said finally. Renee called on a Sunday afternoon while Delia was in the garden. She had hired a landscape designer named Adaize Nwosu, who specialized in naturalistic gardens and who had walked the chapel grounds with her eyes lit up in the way of someone encountering a problem they find deeply interesting. Together, they had designed something that worked with the wildness of the oaks rather than against it. Native plantings, a restored version of the original garden wall, a path that picked up the faint ghost of the old one still visible in the earth. Delia was on her knees in the dirt, pulling volunteer sapling from the base of the garden wall, when her phone rang. She answered with a dirty glove, holding the phone away from her ear. "I owe you an apology," Renee said, without preamble, which was unusual for her, because Renee's apologies were usually so structurally complex, they were difficult to identify as apologies until they were almost over. "You don't," Delia said. "I do. I told you to sleep on my couch. I told you this was foolish. I told you that a condemned chapel, it wasn't condemned. I told you that a structurally compromised chapel in the middle of nowhere was not a solution for a 7-year-old child." A pause. "You were right, and I was wrong, and I want you to know that I know that." Delia sat back on her heels in the garden. The October light was warm on the stone walls of the chapel, the oaks overhead at their peak color, the gold and red of them catching the sun in a way that made the whole place seem lit from inside. "Renee," she said, "you were doing what you thought was right. You love us. That was never the question. But I didn't believe in you," Renee said. "That was the question." Delia was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "That was the question." Another pause, longer this time. "I've always done that," Renee said quietly. "Since we were small, I always thought I was the responsible one, the realistic one, the one who knew how things worked. I thought you were the dreamer." "I am the dreamer," Delia said. "I know," Renee said. "I just didn't know dreamers were right sometimes." "Dreamers are right more often than people think," Delia said. "They just usually don't have anyone willing to wait for the proof." Renee exhaled slowly. "Can I come see it?" "The chapel?" "Come for Thanksgiving," Delia said. "Mama's coming too." A brief silence. "Mama and I at the same table." "My table," Delia said, which was a sentence she had never said before in her life, because there had never been a table that was hers. "My table, my chapel, my rules. You'll be fine." Renee made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Delia." The landlord from Ridley Street called, which she had not expected. His name was Martin Greer, and he had the professional cheerfulness of a man who had learned to deliver bad news in a pleasant tone, and had applied that skill to all subsequent communications, regardless of their content. He called on a Wednesday morning and said he was just checking in, or just wanted to see how she and Camille were getting on. He'd seen the news, of course. Remarkable situation. Remarkable story. She listened to him for approximately 45 seconds. Then she said, "Mr. Greer, you called me twice in the last week of my tenancy to ask when I was leaving. I was packing 2 garbage bags. I had a 7-year-old daughter." He was quiet. "I'm doing well," she said. "Thank you for calling." She hung up. She stood in the vestry, which had been converted into a proper bedroom for Camille, with the glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, and the green pillow, and Gerald on his designated spot. And she looked at the window that looked out into the oaks, and she felt something that she searched for a word for and finally found. The word was uncomplicated. She felt it without the mixture of other things that feelings usually came embedded in. She felt it cleanly. She felt free. The supervisor from the packaging plant did not call, which was fine. She had 14 years of her life in that place, and it had ended in a manila envelope and a handshake from a man who couldn't meet her eyes, and she had no need for a phone call from him. Some endings were endings, and that was sufficient. But she thought about those 14 years. She thought about what she had learned in them, not from the work itself, though she had learned things from that too, but from the experience of being good at something and being overlooked for it, of doing the job correctly and thoroughly for 14 years and being released without ceremony, of understanding that the system she was working within had not been built to see her. She thought about that, And then she thought about what she wanted to do with what she had now, and the two thoughts connected in a way that felt right. She contacted the packaging plant 3 weeks after the appellate ruling. Not the supervisor. The floor workers, the ones she had stood beside for 14 years. The ones she knew by name and shift schedule, and the particular way they held their shoulders at the end of a long day. She sent a letter through the union representative, a woman named Janet, who had represented the floor workers for 12 years, and who called Delia back within an hour of receiving the letter. "You want to do what?" Janet said. "Janet, I want to establish an emergency relief fund for workers who experience sudden job loss," Delia said. "Administered through the union. Grants, not loans. Enough to cover 2 to 3 months of basic expenses while people find their footing." "How much are we talking about?" Delia told her. Janet was quiet for a moment. "Delia, that's significant." "I know what sudden job loss feels like," Delia said. "I know it in a very specific way. I know what 2 weeks of severance and a handshake looks like from the inside. I want to make sure that the gap between the thing that ends and the thing that begins is survivable for people." Janet was quiet again. "When I heard about what happened to you, with the chapel and everything," she said finally, "my first thought was good for her. And my second thought was, she'll probably just take care of herself now. That's what I thought." Another pause. "I was wrong." "You were operating on precedent," Delia said. "It's a reasonable thing to do." "I want to shake your hand," Janet said. "Come to the chapel," Delia said. "I'll make coffee." Camille came home from school on a November afternoon and found her mother in the nave, sitting in the front pew, looking at the restored window. The light was going gold and low through the oaks, the late November light that arrived at a steep angle and turned everything it touched into something specific and irreplaceable. Camille sat down beside her, dropping her backpack and her library book, and pulling Gerald out of the top of the bag by one ear. She looked at the window, too. "Mrs. Aldridge says you're going to speak at Career Day," Camille said. "Mrs. Aldridge asked me to," Delia said. "I said yes." Camille nodded. "What are you going to say?" Delia looked at the woman in blue, whole now, her colors true, the late light moving through her in deep, clean waves. "I'm going to tell them about listening," she said. "To what?" "To things that other people don't notice. Floors, echoes, things that seem like they have nothing to tell you, but actually have everything to tell you if you're quiet enough to hear them." Camille thought about this. "Like when I heard the floor?" "Exactly like when you heard the floor." Camille was quiet for a moment. "I just thought it was interesting," she said. "I didn't know it was important." "That's how it usually works," Delia said. "The things that turn out to be the most important usually announce themselves very quietly. They just wait for someone to be paying attention." Camille leaned against her mother's arm. "Will you tell them about me?" "I'll tell them that the most important thing I heard in the last year, I heard because my daughter was listening first." Camille was satisfied with this. She picked up her library book and opened it, and began to read, her feet swinging, Gerald balanced on one knee, the light from the window catching the side of her face. Delia looked at her daughter, in the light of the chapel, and thought about Sister Marguerite, writing by candlelight in 1889. "To whosoever receives this trust." She had received it. She knew that now, not as a legal fact, but as a true thing. The kind of true that goes below language into the place where understanding lives. She had received it not because she was special or chosen in some mystical sense, but because she had been present and attentive and willing, and she had had Camille beside her, asking the right question at the right moment, and together they had been the right witness. The restoration of St. Agatha's Chapel was completed in early December, and when it was done, when Paul Dembski's crew had loaded the last of their tools and driven back down Hollow Creek Road, Delia walked through the building alone. She went slowly, the way she had gone through it the first time, touching things, noticing things, letting the space tell her what it was now. It was the same building. The stone walls were the same walls. The floor was the same floor. The bell tower, destabilized now, its lean corrected, stood straight against the winter sky. The window at the front was the same woman in blue, mended, her colors restored, looking out over the nave with the patient expression of someone who has been looking out over the same space for 138 years and finds it consistently worthwhile. But it was also a different building. The kitchen Paul had built in the back was small and efficient, with good cabinets and a proper stove, and a window over the sink that looked into the garden Adais had planted. The 2 guest rooms were clean and well lit, with beds and the smell of new plaster and the sound of the oaks outside. The vestry, Camille's room, had glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and a bookshelf full of library books that Camille renewed every 2 weeks with the dedication of a scholar. The nave itself was clean and open, the pews arranged differently now, some removed to create a clear space in the center, because Delia had a plan for the nave, and the plan required open space. She had been thinking about what to do with the nave since early October, turning it over and setting it down and picking it up again. She had thought about it the way she thought about the trust itself, from the edges in, ruling out what didn't fit. It didn't fit to close the chapel. It had been closed too long. It had held its gold in the dark for 135 years, faithful to its purpose. And now the gold was gone, and the space remained, and it deserved to be used. What it fit to do was to open it. Not as a religious space, not as a museum, not as a tourist attraction for people who wanted to see the place where the gold had been found, but as a community space, a gathering place, available to organizations and people who needed a room to meet in, a hall to gather in, a space that was not conditioned on purchase or productivity. She had discussed this with the St. Agatha Trust Board, which she had established with Okafor and 2 community members, a woman who ran the county food bank named Lorraine Adeyemi, and a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Foster, who had taught Delia in 7th grade, and whom she had thought to call because he was the only teacher she had ever had, who seemed to understand that paying attention was itself a form of intelligence. The board had approved. The chapel was now officially a community space, free of charge, available by reservation to nonprofits, community groups, school programs, and individuals who needed a place to meet. There was a calendar on the door and a phone number that reached Delia's desk in the vestry where she had set up a small office, and the calendar was already filling. The food bank wanted to use the space for its volunteer training. A grief support group had asked for Tuesday evenings. A tutoring program from the college had reserved Saturday mornings. She stood in the nave on the day the restoration was complete and looked at the open space and the restored window and the floor with its old-growth oak planks and its gaps and its particular echo. And she thought that it was right. It was exactly right. She crouched beside the altar, which was still in its place at the front, and she pressed her hand flat against the floor. The echo was there. She could feel it through her palm, the resonance, the depth, the sense of something below that had room to receive. The crypt was empty now. The gold was gone, converted into numbers in a trust account that would distribute itself carefully over many years to people who needed it. The stone shelves were bare. The wooden box that had held Sister Marguerite's letter was gone, carefully stored now in an archival facility at the Ohio Historical Society, where Dr. Hartwick had arranged for it to be preserved and eventually exhibited. The letter itself was a matter of court record, publicly accessible, a 137-year-old piece of writing that had been intended for exactly this purpose and had found it. But the crypt itself remained. The stone steps, the arched ceiling, the cut limestone walls. She had left it accessible, a floor section still removable, still marked. Not a secret anymore, but not a spectacle either. Just a space. A space that had served its purpose and was now resting. She stood up, walked to the center of the nave, put one foot down deliberately. The echo came back to her, familiar and particular, the sound of the floor carrying the impact downward and returning it changed. She smiled. Thanksgiving came with a cold rain that arrived Wednesday night and didn't let up through Thursday morning, and Delia spent the morning in the kitchen she had built, cooking, which she did with the focused pleasure of someone who has a proper kitchen for the first time in a long time and intends to use it fully. Her mother arrived first, on driving a rental car from Dayton because her mother didn't trust highways and had driven slowly and arrived an hour and a half after she'd said she would, which was exactly how her mother had always operated, and which Delia found, for the first time in her memory, entirely endearing. She stood in the garden gate watching her mother get out of the car and look at the chapel with an expression that moved through several registers. Surprise, reassessment, something that might have been awe, and finally settled on a look Delia recognized as her mother, deciding to approve of something. Her mother walked through the gate and stood in the cleared garden and looked at the limestone walls and the restored window and the bell tower standing straight against the gray winter sky. "It's beautiful," her mother said. "Yes," Delia said, for her mother looked at her. "You built this." "I restored it," Delia said. "Someone else built it. I just listened to what it needed." Her mother looked at her for a moment longer, with the expression of a woman revising a long-held understanding. And then she opened her arms, and Delia walked into them. Because some things don't need more words than that. Renee arrived 40 minutes later, with a casserole she had made in Columbus, and driven with on the passenger seat, holding it level at every turn in a way that Delia could picture perfectly and found entirely characteristic. Renee walked through the chapel door and stopped in the nave and looked around slowly, taking in the stone walls, the window, the open space, the pews arranged around the edges. She stood for a long time without speaking. "I thought it would look different," she said finally. "How?" "I don't know. Smaller. More ordinary." She looked at the window. "It's extraordinary, Delia." "I know." Renee looked at her sister. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you." "I know that, too." "I'm going to keep saying it until it lands right." "It's landed," Delia said. "Come help me in the kitchen." Camille spent the dinner in full conversational authority, moving between topics with the freedom of a child who has a captive audience that loves her. She explained to her grandmother the structural differences between Romanesque and Gothic architecture as she understood them from her book. She explained to Renee why she intended to be an architect, and specifically the kind of architect who built things to last, because lasting was more important than looking nice. And she explained the difference between the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling that were brightest and the ones that were not quite as bright, and why she had arranged them in that particular pattern. Delia watched her daughter hold the table and felt the particular fullness of a parent watching their child be entirely and unself-consciously themselves in a space that belonged to them. And the fullness was so complete, it sat in her chest like something solid. After dinner, when her mother was washing the dishes and Renee was drying them in a silent but functional domestic partnership that was the closest the two of them had ever been to harmonious, Camille pulled Delia by the hand into the nave. "I want to show Grandma the echo," Camille said. "Show her," Delia said. Camille walked to the center of the nave, not to the spot she had found weeks ago that produced the clearest resonance, and put her foot down, deliberately. The echo returned, that familiar depth, the sound of the floor carrying the impact into the space below and sending it back changed. Her mother came out of the kitchen, dish towel in hand, and looked. "Do you hear it?" Camille asked. Her grandmother listened, put her own foot down, tentatively, near Camille's spot. "I hear it," she said. "Why does it do that?" Camille asked. Her grandmother looked at her. "What do you think?" Camille considered the floor with the seriousness she brought to all questions she considered genuinely interesting. "I think it's because there's something underneath that's listening," she said. "And when you make a sound, it answers you." Her grandmother looked at Delia across the nave. Delia looked back at her mother and thought about all the floors she had stood on in her life. The floor of the apartment on Ridley Street, the floor of the packaging plant, the floor of the unemployment office, the floor of the township building where she had signed a piece of paper and for $1 received a building that the world had forgotten. She thought about all the times she had made a sound and nothing had answered. And she thought about this floor, this specific floor, which had answered. "She's right," Delia said. "That's exactly what it is." The winter that followed was quiet in the way of winters that come after long storms, the kind of quiet that has substance to it, that isn't absence, but presence. Delia worked at her desk in the vestry most mornings, managing the trust's operations, reviewing grant applications, corresponding with the organizations using the nave, attending to the paperwork that was the daily texture of being responsible for something significant. She had not gone back to the plant. She had not looked for a job. She had found, to her slight surprise, that managing the trust was a full-time occupation and a meaningful one, and that doing it well required all the things she was actually good at: attention, precision, the ability to hold a complicated situation in her mind and navigate it without losing the thread. She was good at it. She had always been good at this kind of work. She had just never had work that matched her to find out. She thought sometimes about what her life had been before the chapel, the years of careful management of insufficient resources, the constant calculation, not the way she had learned to be precise, because imprecision was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had thought of those skills as survival skills, things she had developed because she had to. She understood now that they were also just skills, useful in any context, applicable to any scale. The scale had changed. The skills had not needed to. She went down into the crypt one last time in January, on a Sunday afternoon, when the chapel was empty and the winter light was flat and still outside the windows. She had not been down since the gold was removed, since the court officers had supervised the transfer in early July, since the space had been formally emptied and documented and closed in the legal sense. She lit a candle she had brought with her, a simple white candle in a holder, and she descended the stone steps. The crypt was exactly as she had left it. The stone shelves bare now, the arched ceiling, the stone table at the far end where the wooden box had stood, the cool, dry air, the mineral smell, unchanged. She set the candle on the stone table and stood in its light. The space looked different, empty, larger somehow, more itself. When the bars had been there, the room had been full of their presence, heavy and expectant. Now it was just a room, a well-built room, a room that had served its purpose and been emptied by the completion of that purpose. She thought about Sister Marguerite. She thought about the woman writing in 1889, knowing she was building something for a purpose she would not live to see completed. Knowing that the completion was not hers to witness, but someone else's, someone she could not name or picture or predict, on only trust. She thought about trust, the word itself, how it meant both the legal instrument and the act of faith. She had received a trust in both senses. She had been trusted by a woman who had been dead for 100 years, trusted with the specific task of receiving what was given and using it rightly. She stood in the crypt with the candle and thought about whether she had used it rightly. The bed, with the white frame and the carved leaves, the green pillows, the glow-in-the-dark stars. Camille reading 3 levels above her grade. The community calendar on the chapel door filling every week. The emergency relief fund at the plant, which had already helped 11 workers in its first 3 months. The scholarship program, which had its first cohort of recipients, 6 students at Briar Falls Community College, none of whom knew yet what their futures would look like, but all of whom now had slightly less to fear about the cost of finding out. She thought about all of that, and concluded, standing alone in the candlelit crypt in January, that yes, she had used it rightly. She picked up the candle. She climbed the stairs for the last time. At the top, she slid the floor section back into place. She moved the altar table back to where it had always stood, over the floor section, above the crypt, occupying its proper place. And she stood with her hands flat on the surface of the altar table and felt, through the oak, the faint resonance of the space below. The echo. Still there. Always there. She lifted her hands. She blew out the candle. She stood in the nave in the winter light with the restored window and the old floor and the stone walls that had been standing for 138 years and were good for 138 more. She thought about Camille's question, asked on the first day they had stood in this space, asked with the pure curiosity of a child who does not yet know that some questions are not supposed to be asked because the answers are too large. Why does the floor echo, Mama? She knew the answer now. She had always known it, really. It had been waiting for her, the same way the chapel had been waiting, the same way the gold had been waiting, the same way Sister Marguerite's letter had been waiting, in the particular patience of things that are built to last. The floor echoed because there was something beneath it worth listening to. The floor echoed because the world is full of things hidden in plain sound, in plain sight, in the ordinary textures of a day that could be dismissed or could be attended to, and the only difference between finding them and missing them is whether you are willing to crouch down and press your palm to the floor and listen. The floor echoed because her daughter had been listening. She walked to the door of the chapel and opened it. Outside, the January air was sharp and clean, the oaks bare overhead, their branches making intricate patterns against the pale sky. The garden wall was visible under a light dusting of snow, the native plants dormant, waiting for spring. The iron gate at the end of the path stood straight and open. Down Hollow Creek Road, a car turned in, moving slowly over the cracked asphalt. As it got closer, she could see it was the school bus, dropping off the afternoon route, which included the stop at the end of Hollow Creek Road, where Camille had been getting off every day since September. The bus stopped. The door opened. Camille came down the steps with her backpack and her library book, and Gerald's ears sticking out of the top of the bag, and she looked up the road and saw her mother standing in the door of the chapel in the winter light. She waved. Delia waved back. Camille started up the path, her boots crunching in the thin snow, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. When she reached the gate, she stopped and looked up at the chapel, the way she sometimes did, as though she were still figuring it out, still assessing what it was to her. "Mama," she said. "Yes, baby. Is this home?" Delia looked at the limestone walls and the restored window and the bell tower straight against the winter sky, and she thought about the 2 garbage bags and the $1 and the echo in the floor and all the things that had happened in between. "Yes," she said, "this is home." Camille walked through the gate and up the path and took her mother's hand, and together they went inside. The door of St. Agatha's chapel closed behind them. Outside, in the January silence, the oaks stood over the limestone walls, the way they had stood for 138 years, patient and enormous, their bare branches writing something against the sky that no one had ever been able to read, but that had always been there, always saying the same thing, to anyone who was quiet enough and close enough and willing enough to listen. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.